37 minutes, no raised voices, no dramatic walkouts, no viral one-liners designed for applause, just a composed, calculated exchange that may have done more damage than months of rallies, headlines, and campaign messaging combined. By the time the segment ended, it wasn't just another interview. It felt like a shift, subtle but unmistakable, in the balance of political momentum. From the moment the broadcast began, something felt different. There was no sense of urgency to dominate the airtime, no rush to overwhelm the viewer with rapid-fire talking points. Instead, the tone was deliberate, controlled, almost surgical. Every response seemed measured, every pause intentional. And that restraint created something rare in modern political media: space for the audience to actually absorb what was being said. What unfolded wasn't chaos, it was precision. The exchange opened with familiar ground: economic direction, policy decisions, global positioning, topics that often get lost in layers of abstraction and partisan framing. But this time, they didn't drift. They stayed anchored. Numbers were referenced, timelines were revisited, context was restored, and with each passing minute, the conversation moved further away from surface-level rhetoric and deeper into substance. That's when the dynamic began to shift, because instead of reacting defensively or leaning into rehearsed responses, the approach remained steady, focused. Each answer didn't just address the question, it reframed it. It connected individual decisions to broader consequences, linking policy with impact in a way that was difficult to dismiss or ignore. Viewers noticed. And more importantly, they stayed. In an era where attention spans are short and distractions are endless, holding an audience for that long without theatrics is no small feat. But this wasn't about spectacle. It was about clarity. And clarity, when delivered effectively, can be more compelling than any headline-grabbing moment. About 10 minutes in, the conversation began to tighten. The questions became more specific, the framing more direct, and what had started as a standard interview began to feel like something else entirely, a structured unraveling of key narratives that had, until that point, gone largely unchallenged in that format. There were no interruptions, no need to speak over one another, and yet, the pressure was undeniable. Because the strategy wasn't confrontation, it was consistency. Each point built on the last. Each answer reinforced a larger theme, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the conversation boxed itself into a corner. Not through force, but through accumulation. Facts layered on facts. Context layered on context. Until the broader picture became harder and harder to dispute. This is where the impact deepened. In political discourse, it's easy to dismiss isolated critiques. A single statistic can be challenged, one argument can be reframed, but when multiple lines of reasoning converge, when they align into a coherent, sustained narrative, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes persuasive, and persuasion, unlike performance, lingers. Midway through the segment, the tone remained unchanged, but the stakes felt higher. The discussion moved beyond policy into accountability, not in an accusatory sense, but in a clarifying one. Decisions were revisited not just as choices, but as turning points, moments with consequences that extended beyond headlines and into real-world outcomes. That shift mattered because it transformed the conversation from theoretical to tangible. It grounded abstract debates in lived realities, and in doing so, it forced a different kind of engagement from the audience, not passive listening, but active consideration. At one point, a question was posed that seemed almost understated. No dramatic buildup, no loaded language, just a direct inquiry that cut through layers of prior discussion and landed squarely at the core of the issue. The response that followed didn't explode into controversy. It didn't need to, because by that stage, the groundwork had already been laid. The contrast was clear, the implications were evident, and the audience didn't need to be told what to think. They could see it for themselves. That's what made the moment powerful. Not volume, not aggression, but inevitability. By the final stretch of the interview, something else became apparent. Control had never shifted. From beginning to end, the structure held. The pacing remained steady, and the narrative, once established, was never lost. This is a rare outcome in live television, where unpredictability often defines the format. But here, unpredictability was replaced by discipline, and discipline, in this context, proved far more effective. When the segment concluded, there was no dramatic closing statement. No attempt to summarize or amplify the impact, just a natural end to a conversation that had already said everything it needed to say. And yet, the real story began after the cameras stopped rolling. Within minutes, clips began circulating across digital platforms. Key exchanges were isolated, replayed, analyzed. Viewers who hadn't watched the full segment were suddenly drawn into the conversation, not because of a single viral moment, but because of the cumulative weight of the entire exchange. Commentators began dissecting what had just happened. Some framed it as a strategic breakthrough. Others described it as a recalibration of how political communication can, and perhaps should, be conducted in high-stakes environments. But beneath the analysis, there was a broader recognition. This moment felt different. Not necessarily because it introduced entirely new information, but because it presented existing information in a way that was coherent, structured, and difficult to ignore. It bridged the gap between complexity and accessibility, allowing a wider audience to engage with issues that are often confined to policy circles and expert discussions. That accessibility is where the long-term impact lies, because political narratives aren't just shaped by what is said, they're shaped by what is understood. And when understanding increases, so does scrutiny. Questions become sharper, expectations rise, and the space for vague or inconsistent messaging begins to narrow. This is why moments like this matter. They don't just influence immediate reactions, they alter the framework through which future conversations are interpreted. They set a new baseline, a new standard, and once that standard is established, it becomes harder to revert to less substantive forms of engagement without being noticed. In the days that follow, the ripple effects will continue to unfold. Analysts will revisit the segment, campaigns will adjust messaging, media coverage will reflect the shift, whether subtly or explicitly. But perhaps the most significant impact will be among viewers, the individuals who watched, listened, and formed their own conclusions. Because ultimately, that's where the real power of a moment like this resides. Not in headlines, not in commentary, but in perception. And perception, once changed, is difficult to reverse. This wasn't about a single interview. It was about a demonstration of how clarity can cut through noise, how composure can outmatch confrontation, and how a well-constructed argument, delivered with precision, can resonate far beyond the confines of a television segment. 37 minutes. That's all it took to remind an audience that in a landscape dominated by volume and spectacle, substance still has the power to command attention and to change the conversation in ways that are both immediate and enduring. And now the only question that remains is not whether this moment mattered, but how far its impact will reach.